Hi, everybody. Today's December 1st, 2023, and it's actually 12123. I'm here with Mark Changizi, who is brilliant, and I'll let him a little bit self-introduce.
Yeah, glad to be here. I'm a PhD mathematics, undergrad physics, math, and I became a kind of a cognitive scientist, theorist. Things like, why do we see in color? Color vision is actually optimized to see blood under the skin, to see emotions. How did we come to have eyes that face forward? Sort of design questions. Why we're structured. Eyes face forward to actually let you see better and see through stuff. Why do you get pruny fingers when you're wet? They're actually rain treads. How did we come to have language at all? Kind of a common question from Chomsky and Pinker and stuff. Argued against them in my book, Harnessing. We didn't evolve to have language, and it's not the case that we just are plastic and can learn anything. No, language culturally evolved to sound like nature, and actually writing culturally evolved to look like nature, so that it can harness our existing object recognition recognition capabilities, or our event recognition capabilities in the case of speech. These are just 3 or 4 varieties of kind of the stuff that I work on, which are highly sort of theoretical, but concerning emergent systems and design. And so a lot of the stuff so once COVID hit, I was really, since day one of COVID, I've been pushing back on the lockdowns. A lot of the folks that now know me don't know me because of my TED Talks and my science, but they know me because I was like sort of a COVID lockdown. I was a denier, right? But my focus there was, in addition to arguing against masks and arguing the importance of a face, and I, got many hundreds of videos on free expression and against lockdowns and all these, but also trying to understand the psychosocial physics of what was going on. That March 9th, everything was cool. March 11th, the whole world was sort of wanting lockdowns yesterday, and had a new quasi-religion was born. How did these things happen? And trying to understand it from a scientific point of view, someone who's sort of understands physics and emergent systems and selection processes. That's been a lot of what I focused on for the last 3.5 years.
Well, there's a lot to dissect there. It's kind of a funny thing. How do we just as a quick question come to mind, how given the formulations you've put in, how do we actually get this scientific intellect, and who can do that? How can one place oneself outside of the masses and the mass formations, whether they're psychotic or not, that we get? How does one get to be an evaluator or scientist, and what are the qualifications, and who was and who wasn't during the last episode? And then we'll try to bring it up to some of the current events and the kind of various mass formations we get of late, with October 7th massacre, et cetera.
Yeah, how does one avoid falling into sort of these social contagions when they go through? Now, in my case, I feel like there was a couple reasons that maybe overdetermined why I didn't fall for the sort of mass hysteria COVID, zero COVID kind of call. One was because I had left academia 12, 13 years before. I had started my own research institute. I wanted to buy my intellectual freedom. I'm a theorist, and in academics, really to survive, you've got to bring in grant money, regularly bring in huge grant money, keep bringing huge grant money. And I'm a theorist, and so when you get grant money, you're almost invariably doing experiments, and that's the yardstick by which you measure success, is the grants, and you get them by virtue of saying, I'm going to do all these experiments. So I was like, I don't want to do these experiments. These guys are bright guys and gals, are bright experimentalists, really clever folks at being an experimentalist. I'm a good theorist. It's just a different kind of animal. So I bought my intellectual freedom by leaving academia, and by leaving academia, that certainly left me more socially aloof than I would have been. Even when I was in academics, I was purposely aloof. I even would give little sheets, sort of try to teach my grad students how to remain aloof in life, so that you're not falling into groupthink within the conference community. And I had always described, I wouldn't go to conferences unless I was invited for a keynote. I didn't go to the conferences in whatever field that I had just made some discovery in, because when you do that, pretty soon you get to know who all the big shots are, and you look up to the big shots because that's normal. And then by the time you've got something under your belt, then all of the young shots, the young people look up to you, and they're treating you like a big shot. And then all the problems in that field, that stupid field over there, not us. They don't even have their heads straight, right? You start to minimize the importance of all the other fields because that's what everybody talks about. Like we've got all the important questions, and so you quickly aren't going to be willing to move to other fields because all of the social richness and all of life and all the important questions are all in that tiny box that you've mentally spread to fill out the entire intellectual space. So I was always trying to remain aloof because as a theorist, I'm not an experimentalist. I can't just stay in one field and kind of incrementally do stuff. I got to move to a new field and hope to have some grand unifying theory in that field, and hopefully move again to another field. So those were two things that that helped me, I think, and as a cognitive scientist, I'm much more aware, consciously, sort of top down, thinking about these sorts of biases, cognitive biases, and this susceptibility to groupthink, social contagion, and so forth. So I think those sorts of things help protect me. But if I had been sitting in academia, and if I wasn't a theorist, and I was surrounded by all these, as it turns out, far leftists, 97%, right? I would have fallen for the COVID hysteria just like everybody else. Why wouldn't I? If my social network was those guys, right? We all believe what we believe because the social network in which we sit. I, as a scientist, have discovered maybe 15 different things that I have the t-tests and statistical analysis and everything. All the other 100 million things that I know is because someone told me and some other people independently confirmed it. Same for all of us, right? And they're high reputation people in my social network. So if I had sat in that milieu, I would have been the biggest COVID Karen. Why wouldn't I have been, right? And I think the other thing that potentially saved me is I'm a libertarian, strongly constrained by civil liberties. So even if I had fallen for it, all the stuff, it's disproportionately dangerous, altogether novel virus, and lockdowns totally work. And I still would have said, no, you're not allowed to do that because I'm committed to civil liberties and informed consent and all of these suite of classical liberal principles that you can't violate no matter how much you want to, right? So I think those are the kinds of things that at least I can say after the fact, post hoc, I can say might have saved me, right? These are a post hoc explanation. I don't really know the true explanation. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's I understand that. It's kind of a funny phenomenon, and I've been a little bit of an outsider, kind of cowboy physician. I've got that little MD after my name, wherever it happens to be. Yeah, can't quite point to it. But I was kind of solo, had my own primary care, and I wound up kind of evaluating things. I don't think for a standard sore throat, I don't think my treatment was miraculously different from anybody else. But at a certain point, HRT, hormone replacement therapy for what we used to call women, I don't know what we call them these days, was the thing until like 2000, 1997, 2000, whatever. And then all of a sudden, kind of like this major flip, that it was, had a slight increased rate of breast cancer association, and everyone stopped writing it, like all of a sudden. Yeah. And I think that I don't think there was really a cost benefit analysis done, but I was on my own, and I kind of researched this and spent a lot of time on it, and I decided HRT was again up to women's choice, as it were. Remember that phrase, women's choice. And I let it up to them that they would have some benefits, sexually, physically, kind of retain their youthful figure, blah blah blah, through menopause, avoid the hot flashes, better bone strength, and they get mammograms, and then presumably reduce the risk of that slight 10% higher rate of breast cancer because they'd be more assiduous about getting mammograms. Now, like a few decades later, people are kind of coming around to my point of view, which I never left in the first place. And had I been in an institution where everybody's doing that, and then it's kind of an opprobrium, censoring, and prohibition, and scorning and whatnot, I don't know. That's a different thing. So it's kind of like the metaphor I always bring up is schooling. We go to school, we've been schooled, and the word for whatever reason, when you deal with fish, is they school. They're in a group, and they all are watching the other fish. And so a school of fish will move simultaneously one direction up. That was the action that happened with the HRT, kind of mass prohibition.
No leader, right? There need not be a leader, right, either. Right.
Yeah, and that's kind of segues a little bit to the modern event of what's happening with schooling, with what I call the Hamassacre. And I'd kind of like to go. You've had some really, I think seminal posts. The kind of the strong man, what is it? Basically people following the strong horse. the PR victory that was the massacre itself, in a sense. We can go at these sequentially, but maybe you could just give people a broad stroke overview of what your interpretation of is what happened at that time and what has been happening, in the talkiverse, the metaverse, this kind of like secondary game that people play.
Yeah. Well, the narrative quickly came to be that if only Israel would just have not overreacted with its with its retaliation, then the PR win would have gone to poor Israel for the massacre, right? And this is I'm not sure how long the day that they shot their first retaliatory missile at Hamas is the day that narrative started. It completely is a false narrative. What happened was, by the end of day 10/7, much of the world had seen that there was a humiliation by the big dog in this conflict. Israel's the big dog relative to Hamas. And that humiliation to this little underdog, Hamas, created a PR extravaganza for Hamas, which was the point. It energized not only Hamas and other Gazans that were wanting more jihadi types, but it energized and brought out of the woodwork potentially hundreds of millions of folks in the West who suddenly were scrambling to be the first on social media or the first in my comments on 10/7 itself to say 75 years, it's totally, you should look at it in the context, all of this kind of stuff from the left or from the right. Well, I don't think that really Hamas did that. It's really, if they did do it, it's only because it was coordinated by Netanyahu. If it happened at all, really, this is just a psyop, this kind of conspiracy theory far right. All of these folks, it wasn't 2 weeks, no, it was 2 hours after they heard that they were jumping at the bit to let some of that humiliation, that reputation that fell off of Israel for losing the battle that day, to absorb some of that, and this new strong horse of Hamas to become part of it. Just like when there's this is why we like Rocky. The story Rocky is a story of an underdog, and people didn't necessarily love Rocky until he won. And when Rocky won, because of all the trash talk ahead of time, trash talk. This is why they take fighters. They actually grew up fighting in the same gym, right? They love each other, the two fighters, but they put them up beforehand, and they say start saying shit to one another, and then they know what they have to do because they want to hype the fight. So they pretend, and sometimes it gets real, like they kind of lose track and they get a little bit out of control. They actually do develop some animosity, but they do that so that there's all this buildup. They're pushing social capital, the reputation on the table. The other is, and more and more. And then what you're really interested in when you're watching fights and conflicts is watching that reputation get disseminated back to one or the other side. That's why we watch, right? If there was no hype, I'm not really that interested. Why aren't you interested? Because there's no stake. There's nothing put at stake. It's going to be just pushed. So the reason that we came to love Rocky was after he won. After the underdog won, it wasn't like it's not like Israel's humiliation brought out of the woodwork people who are anti-Semites already. It's not that simple. It created a whole new generation of anti-Semites who were suckered in some sense, to rallying around Rocky. In this case, Rocky was Hamas, right? It's a very human reaction to want to join the team of the person who just clobbered the big guy. That's exactly what happened. And that happened by the end of day 10/7. This is what, and just yesterday or today, Hamas's leader, whatever his name is, said,
Yahya Sinwar.
Yeah, we killed these people. We killed these civilians and children and babies and raped them to energize our movement. We did it to energize our movement. This is how we energize our movement. And he's right? He I don't know, he hasn't studied, maybe he studied this or doesn't, but he knows in his bones how these things work. And he didn't just energize the typical Palestinian radical jihadi types. He energized the far left progressive, everything is the fault of Israel or the West, and the far conspiracy theory right pandemic types that I've been fighting against for 3.5 years, who think it's all a massive psyop, and the Jews are behind 9/11, they're behind COVID, they're behind everything, right?
Wild stuff. It's almost nowhere to go after this. It's it's a weird thing, to I mean, terrorism is a successful industry. I mean, people don't realize how successful it is. Yasser Arafat was, I guess, an engineer born in Cairo, and he, died a billionaire, I gather, or whatever when he died. I mean, in today's monetary equivalent, and very little, few skills. I mean, his engineering kind of dropped away, but the threat of violence is a powerful motivator. I think many people live in fear, and they work on the power dynamic, with rare exception. I don't want to get too far afield, but there was a telling interview between what's his name, Ross Sorkin at the New York Times, and Elon Musk just the other day. And Elon Musk, said GFY. Basically Sorkin he didn't really understand his interviewee, and was kept saying, how can you, not pay attention to Disney wanting to boycott you? Why don't you, basically bend to their wishes? And you have to pay attention. You have to, basically, there's a power structure, a power thing. And Musk, he has F you money, and he basically, used that prerogative to say F you. I'm doing what I'm doing, and you can do what you are doing. But for the most part, though, I think people fall into the Sorkin New York Times power dynamic, and people, even though Israel seems to be the minor power player in that tiny sliver of land over there, writ large, as we've seen played out in capitals all throughout Europe and the U.S., the power is demography, and the power is numbers, and people are not looking for reasons; they're looking for identity as Muslims and so forth. And I kind of would like to maybe go down that road a little bit and talk about what is the direction of Islam. And they don't really have a pope, and what is the street? What's the motivation there? Why are people, milling about Hamas, threatening Hamas for Hamas, threateningly and so forth? And where does this lead our kind of, social dynamic, insofar as, Sorkin may be correct that most people, aside from Elon Musk, will accede to, shows of power and force, terror, treason, and so forth?
Yeah, certainly there's a problem with Islam, and the problem is the radical Islamists. But I often, half the time I've been arguing since 10/7 against those in the West, primarily the Hamas supporters, or they'll describe themselves as, no, I'm just anti-Zionist, whatever. But the other half the time I've been arguing there's a against sometimes the pro-Israeli side, which is my side. But a lot of these folks seem to believe that this is Jews versus Muslims, or that it's Israel versus Gaza, or Israel versus Palestine. And it's not. I'm Iranian. My wife is Iranian. My dad was from Iran. And the Iranian community, a huge portion of the Iranian community has been very vocal since 10/7, being pro-Israel. And the reason that so many of us are pro-Israel is not just because it's the right position here, but we also know what it is for our own family to have lived and still live under people like Hamas, right? We know what it's like. I personally, luckily, I grew up in the United States, but my father, when he came here, he didn't live under the Islamic Republic. He was, he's under the Shah, but all the time around him, these sorts of forces are there. You can feel these forces are constantly around, and all of my other family came here after the Islamic Revolution. So we know what it's like to live under brutal Islamic dictators that govern them. And so the victims here are not just the Israelis having to live next to Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the PA and all of these different kinds of forces that all have the same thing in mind, killing Jews. And is the other victims are the Palestinians and the Gazans, who are stuck with these folks as their leaders, right? And they want to say, well, yeah, but they were elected. No, they weren't elected. Hamas wasn't elected. There was never a fair election. Hamas was the kind of folks that would kill anybody that had any substantively different position, and then did so, killed the PA folks that were in there that they had beaten, right? That's not a free and fair election. It was 18 years ago, at any rate, right? So, and they say, well, where are all of these Gazans on the streets arguing and demonstrating against, Hamas? Like, you're not going to see that. First of all, if they did do it, you're not going to see it, because they're not going to let it be seen. And just like in Iran, you don't see all of these protests that were occurring last year with Women Life Freedom. Lots and lots of protests. You barely saw a bit of it because of the crackdown on social media that the government does. And two, very few are willing to do it in the first place because you will be killed and your family will be imprisoned or killed. It's as simple as that. They go, okay, so why are there so many Gazans demonstrating for Hamas? Every dictatorship has some significant fraction of the population that supports it, right? Dictators come in on the backs of a popular support of some, at least minority, who's sufficiently militant. It's almost never just a coup like in some of these tin pot, African nations where there's just a coup this week, someone come and killed it, and then like there's no support. The whole populace is just watching. Oh, okay, and they do. That's not usually what happens. It sometimes happens, but it's rare. Dictatorships have some popular support, and even if it's just 10%, 10% can fill up whatever public square, whatever massive public squares exist in the country. They can fill it up over and over again in numbers, and so it selects for the supporters who just, of course, show up and throw things at the hostages being sent back to Israel. There's always sufficient number, so you can't point to that as evidence about anything in terms of the support from the civilians. It is vacuously true that you will find dictators with huge crowds demonstrating for them. So you can't point to that as evidence of anything, because it's literally a tautology that will be the case, right? So what folks like me believe is that there's at least 40% to 80% of Gazans who are just like, and we see videos of them sometimes coming out where they're saying, start saying bad things about Hamas, and then someone will shut them up. They'll say, shut them up, stop, and they suddenly stop. There's lots of videos I've been compiling threads on. These people don't want this kind of life. The average Muslim is not a radical Islamic, it doesn't have a radical Islamic ideology, but they're dominated in terms of the culture and the threats and the coercion by that. So we have to keep that in mind. It is not 2 billion, Muslims against Christians and Jews or something like this. It's not. There's maybe a 200 million radical jihadi types at best, let's say. It need not even be, it could be 10 times less than that. And they're a seriously dangerous bunch, right? But then you've got another 1.8 billion Muslims who are just getting on in life and don't take any of that stuff. And they figured out some kind of way of living as a Muslim that's not interpreting it in that radical jihadi way. There is no pope. There's no sort of single leader that can create a new culture that sort of interprets everything in such a way that here's our nonviolent way of moving forward, consistent with modern values. But somehow that narrative has already occurred. It's already in the heads of these folks because they live all over the world and they kind of want a regular life like you and me. And so there's somewhere in that cultural narrative of those 1.8 billion is the beginnings of something that hopefully can spread. But there's no question the radical folks are the problem, and they're a big problem.
So what's the, I don't know if this is an appropriate question. What's the solution? What's the end goal of either side in this current Hamas-Israel confrontation?
Well, I mean, the end goal, obviously, for Israel is just the complete elimination of Hamas. And I think that they have the political resolve to do it, despite the constant chance for ceasefire. I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire longer than what's needed to bring kidnapped hostages home. Whether that's going to be enough, it's unclear. But because there's still many other forces at work, there's the Iranian mullahs, to put it mildly, are the biggest funders of this. They have their hands in many such Hamases that are providing, attacking from all sides in some sense. So it's not just Hamas.
Well, for a long time we heard that Iran, being Shia, would never align with Hamas, who was Sunni, I guess. They would do Hezbollah with Shia. That seems, I never really put much weight into that. That doesn't seem to really be in effect. Does Iran, do they have their vulnerabilities? What is the end point, say, in Iran for getting the liberties back for the Iranian people? There was a kind of a bigger thrust towards their, street revolution during the Obama years, and I think, kind of in keeping with character, he shied away from supporting them. I don't think that their version of the Berlin Wall falling would not and could not have occurred under Obama. Maybe under Trump, but the timing was wrong. What is the antidote, the reversal of this kind of like oppressive regime, or is the power just kind of there to bulldoze?
I suspect that in Iran, I mean, there were signs that there was political pressure by virtue of the women life freedom worldwide and within the country. They got the populace got fairly confident for a while. We're out in the streets, but eventually there was many hundreds, if not more than 1,000 executions and crackdowns, and so that as far as I know, there wasn't much after that in terms of demonstrations. But it looked like for a while there was a lot of videos coming out of women on the street with their headscarf off, and videos of them just walking down the street and people high-fiving them, and of course there's lots of videos of still people on the streets snitching on them and trying to arguing and fighting them. But it looked like there might be a sea change because there is a new generation that saw women life freedom happen, were super angry about it, and they're still stewing, but they're just more and more young people are still coming who have the new kinds of opinions in these regards. As far as there's apparently been greater crackdowns, and their morality police have gone on overdrive, reinforcing a proper Muslim attire on both sexes relatively recently. So I think that they're trying to not let it even sneak a little bit out like it seemed to be. So I don't see any way other than a long-term generational changes, and that the newer generations with their just over time things have changed, even if they're still required to headscarf. The headscarves that they wear in the bigger cities kind of pulled back a little bit. They're colorful. They're not just the black chador. The new generations don't want children until they're 38. They're not doing the same kinds of things in the bigger cities. In the small countries, they're much more conservative. These kinds of changes eventually should be felt generationally, but I don't see anything happening fast.
Yeah, no, it's an open question, because getting back to the demography issue, in Turkey, there's really two countries. There's Istanbul and there's the rest of the country. I mean, that's a little bit reductionist, but because there's a whole Southwest and whatnot. But the biggest growth has been around the central area, because people have more kids, and when the army gets filled up, it's kind of the country countryside kids who have grown up more along the fundamental lines and whatnot, and the power. And I don't know if that happens in Iran as well, but the next generation of enlightened happening in these urban areas are somewhat always outnumbered by the more indoctrinated from the rural areas, who have their own internal jealousies and whatnot against the cities. So it's kind of a eternal question. And I think we see this all over the place. I mean, I do a kind of a sideline podcast on Venezuela with a professor from there, and a lot of what you said about the dictatorship has held sway there. I mean, I think Chavez had populist support to a certain degree early on, and there's always going to be this 10% coterie of people on the take, on the make, who are willing to show up and demonstrate and/or club other people. So it's a tough thing, to get out of. It's one of the maybe like a Chinese puzzle box. I don't know how to really do it. And of course, China's its own Chinese puzzle box. It seems that authoritarian regimes are on the march.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to jump in for a second, and this is another thing that folks have often said is, well, if the Gazans aren't all 100% behind Hamas, then why don't they just have a revolution and overthrow them? I was just like, I don't know why people think that people can just overthrow their, authoritarian rulers. This is the hardest thing that humankind has, because no one wants to be the first. Of course, if they all suddenly, if magically you could turn them into zombies and make them all stand up and get a small handgun or knife and all march into this, you could maybe magically make them do it, and it could happen, but it requires that no one ever back down. And so these things never happen. And I'd like to use it. I've been using an example. It's like, because I'm often talking to folks that were on my side during COVID. It's like, look, there was no one threatening to kill us or kill our families during the COVID authoritarianism, but we couldn't stop it, right? We had a little bit of free speech suppression, but not like in these countries where you literally just can't even poke your head up without it getting a shot off, right? We were still had tremendous amounts of speech. We were not able to stop COVID authoritarianism. We couldn't do it, and we had everything going for us here. What makes you think Iranian civilians, Gazan civilians, Palestinian civilians, who will get their head chopped off if they poke it up, can possibly do better than we could when we had all of these advantages? So people don't seem to understand how impossible it is to overthrow dictators with some degree of popular support.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point. So that brings up two questions. How does one get rid of Hamas if every kid has been indoctrinated, and you can't necessarily find the leaders, and then the population, say, swarms back to one place or another? I mean, I there's the term ethnic cleansing, which gets used, but most every country that exists in some level or other got rid of those people who were not themselves or moved them. But Israel didn't. When they took over the 1967 borders of 1949 to 67, Egyptian Gaza, Egypt has not wanted that piece of land back. They don't want to absorb the immigrants. In the Syrian war and so forth, none of the 10 million or so, or 6 to 10 million who migrated, very few of them, I think, migrated to Arab and/or Muslim countries, nor to Turkey and whatnot. They all wind up in Europe. And, because it just seemed kind of an oddity where the, quote unquote, freer countries are absorbing the people who grew up not necessarily, understanding or perhaps appreciating the essence of free discourse, democracy, rights of the minorities and whatnot. And I don't know, there's not really a question there per se. But
well, let me stop you just for a second, because that's, I think, the typical narrative that people say, and I don't think that's right. I think that often the folks in Europe who are suddenly rising up being pro-Hamas, these are sometimes second generation or even third generation Muslim immigrants. Mm-hmm. Their parents, their grandparents came to Europe, and they were just like all my Iranian family. They're so glad to be wherever they are in Europe relative to the crappy, place that they were in the Arab or Persian world. And so you've got this tremendous number of Islamic folks that are in Europe, and almost all of them are happy to be there. But again, it takes just 10% of those that get caught up in this kind of radical, and they're very often second and third generation kids who speak perfect French. They heard all of the civil liberties talk about what it's like to, the important, all the civil, all the stuff that all the kids learn, they know, they've heard it, but they got caught up in their, all of their high school friends or other people who were, from Islamic families. And then they sort of got into these more gang-like kind of, and it got sucked into this radical jihadi thing. But that's not representative of their Islamic communities, which are often either uncles and grandparents, or like, I don't want any of this. You guys are just being dumb. Now, people rightly argue, well, the folks that need to slap these young people, around are the older folks who get why they came to the West, right? But I don't think it's correct to say that it's like all of these Muslims are in Europe because they're there, either to Islamify it. They're not. They're there because they wanted to get away from what they escaped. But some fraction, and it doesn't take much, of the children of those.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, the new Syrian generation of the Syrian diaspora, though, they skipped over all the contiguous countries as asylum seekers, and they went specifically to the places with the best benefits in Europe, and presumably to work and whatnot. But it's a hugely young male contingent, and there's they're not necessarily marrying off because there was predominantly young men, and young men do things differently than family men, than women and whatnot. And there's the potential. I'm not labeling people one way or another, but certainly the numbers are there, and they're going to have a certain desire. They're going to be aggressive. They're not going to be kind of stapled down with a marriage and cohesion and kids and whatnot. And so there's an aspect of that. I don't disagree about what you're saying. Second and third generations. You see that in the UK a lot. I've listened to the accents and whatnot. They're not newcomers, but it's kind of a team sport. I seem like most everything is a team sport. And people are willing to, jump over the rationality of the massacre and all that kind of stuff and just say, oh, these people look like me, or they, go to a similar, mosque as me, and that's pretty much the end of it. I think so much of the world is just turning to team sports.
But except that you have, transgender folks who are identifying with Hamas, right? You've got LGBTQ. So I mean, and you've got far left progressives who have nothing, literally nothing in common. They are as opposite on any dimensional space you can possibly imagine, and they have decided that they're on the same side. And the far right conspiracy, far right, who's really not so much pro-Hamas, but they're just anti-Jew. At the end of the day, they wouldn't describe it this way. They don't really have. In other ways, they're typically pro-civil liberties. But there's nothing in common. So I think you can find it's not as simple as looking at folks who are like you or look like you that puts you on a team. These are this is actually something I've been talking about. So why is it that the far left and the far right are ending up both anti-Israel? And I think that there's a kind of argument that the very far left, I call the very far left and the very far right as conspiracy theorists.
Yep.
Of different types. The far left, and this is sort of a nice way to characterize left and right that it occurred to me recently, rather than the typical Nolan diagram where the left is, personal freedom and the right is more economic freedom, but not personal freedom, and puts them in that kind of diamond. If you've seen that diamond before, right? You get left and right, and it sort of makes sense. But that wouldn't explain why the far left for 9/11 said, well, the fault is the United States. And ended up to be effectively defending Osama bin Laden. And it wouldn't explain why the far right says about 9/11, well, this is a psyop, and it was really the United States that took the buildings down. And then they did the same thing for 10/7. It's the same exact thing. Why is the left and right, when you get far enough, acting in these ways? Well, I think another way to characterize left and right is that the left thinks that people are generally bad. All things equal, we tend to do bad. But there's a cabal of good. When the government is done right and they're socialists, there's a lot of centralization. That right kind of centralized government is able to spread goodness through the world, right? That's the typical left view. This is for socialist communism. And the extreme version of that is that, well, in cases where there's a bunch of people that aren't really our good cabal that explains all the goodness in the world, then those who are more victims, they're more agentless. They have less agency. They're the ones, because anybody who has agency that's not this cabal is wrecking things up. They're fucking things up because they're not taking the heed from the centralized. So Israel has more agency than Hamas. Whoever are more of the victims are the ones that then get treated as the good in these circumstances. So the far right, though, has a general view that people just generally left to their own devices are roughly good. It's good to have decentralized capitalist processes. They typically aren't that. But then when there's folks like some kind of conflict like this, the very far right tends to see evil in the world. Otherwise, it would be good, but there's an evil cabal that explains all the evil that happens, rather than a good cabal that explains otherwise evil. Where the good comes from is it's general goodness, but evil is from this cabal, and that explains why the very far right, although the right is sort of very free market, the very far right often ends up anti-free market because they think that all of these gigantic corporations or the WHO or various kinds of figures are all in fact manipulating the market, and it's all a big scam. And a lot of these people end up to be anti-capitalist, although they're very far right. It's because they think it's all ultimately the Jews or something like this. That's all some scheme, right? Same here. When you end up with an event like 10/7 or 9/11, they're looking at this badness that occurred, and it has to be always due to that cabal, and all cabals typically end with Jews at the top. Yeah.
I'm wondering why, if the Jews are so good at cabals and whatnot, they only wound up with a tiny sliver of a country and so few people on Earth. Like there's 0.1% of people on Earth. I'm wondering.
That just proves that. This is what they'll say.
That just proves how powerful they are. No, it's a weird thing. I grew up in New York City, and New York City, I guess numerically, is the largest Jewish city on earth, more than Tel Aviv. At the time that I was there, anyway. New York City has turned. I think it's become unsafe, to be a Jew there. And this is like one of the best places on earth for Judaism, Jewish thought and whatnot, intellectual thought. And, we have our universities and so forth. I mean, I grew up you know, in I don't know, I grew up maybe, you know, in the 60s and beyond and so forth. And it seems like so many of these things are just kind of like rotted. And I don't really like the appellation far right, because who knows what precisely that is. But in some ways, I do think that, you know, some of these institutions are rotten. I think the WHO may not be actively rotten. I don't think I don't believe in genuine conspiracy. I think they're conspiracies of interest. I think something happens, then people kind of glom along to it, like we've talked about with schooling of fish and whatnot. Something happens and people just kind of like, you know, see where everyone else is gathering. They gather there. But I don't know. Maybe you could speak to, you know, your exodus from the university apparatus and what the universities are like now. Why is it that tenure and tenured professors who are supposed to have courage don't? How has this kind of bred its own little mini cabal of like-minded, you know, basically all leftists within the university?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this goes way back to the 80s even. I mean, this is not new, but it has worsened. It's gone from, you know, I don't know the numbers, but it's one of these things. It was 94% left. Now it's 98.5%. It's gotten even stronger. But these are exactly the kinds of things that you expect to be positive feedback loops in this way. Once you have a preponderance of one, and then the whole culture there is thinking that those who are on the right, and, you know, I don't know anybody who's on the right. Do you? No, I don't know anybody. I don't even know anybody who's a libertarian, you know. Then they think of them as unclean out groups, so they don't want anything to do with them. So that anybody who's, and of course, it's not merely, you know, a lot of these resumes are not going to come up as showing whether they're left or right. So they have, you know, for 25 years, have forced all of us applicants to write little essays about how we would go about bringing social justice to our students, and all of these kinds of code words, which, you know, as a libertarian, like, I'm not even sure what these things mean. So I'm trying to come up with essays to write back in the day that are consistent with my actual values, but somehow twist it to be the answer. And they know that what I'm doing right away. I go, oh, okay, this guy is not playing ball. He's not playing ball and saying kinds of shit that we are basically telling him to say. And if he knew, either he doesn't know, in which case he's out, or he knows and he's trying to, you know, he's not being deferential effectively. Mm-hmm. So there's actually formal mechanisms that ensure this positive feedback loop. So this positive feedback loop, it just means it's getting worse and worse and worse. And you could say, well, fine, you know, as long as the kids are learning physics and, you know, stuff. But when big events like COVID occur, the average academic punches above their weight class in terms of the average person, right? They're Doug or Susie from MIT or from University of Michigan, right? And so you're getting all these experts who are all saying the same thing, and it's not independent opinions anymore because it's a group thing. What you want are independent opinions, and when they're all thinking the same thing because they're in a group think, it's just one opinion that you're getting. So when they say, look, all the experts say this, no, you just have one expert. If you go around measuring, like, look how, you know, 97% of the experts believe in climate change, climate warming, or, you know, global warming. No, you have one expert that's just been repeated multiple times by virtue of the groupthink in the community. So these things are very dangerous in terms of groupthink. The spread of mass hysterias like COVID, you know, quasi-religious spreads of new kinds of cults, as we saw, and I'm not sure, you know, how do you stop this kind of thing? It's going to be difficult because everybody in charge are exactly the same kinds of folks.
You know, I want answers. I want answers on a game plan.
Yeah.
How do you survive outside the university?
Well, I mean, it's been tricky. I had 4 books, I guess. 4 of my 6 books happened after I left proper academia. I had Harnessed on the Origins of Language and Music came after that, and then a book on the origin of art, and this last book on Expressly Human: The Origins of Emotional Expressions. So, and another novel, A Human 3.0. So 4 of my 6 books came out afterwards, but it's better in some ways and it's more difficult in others. I don't get the same kind of, I'm not just getting salary thrown at me for no good reason, right? I have companies and I have to build things that actually bring in money, but I bought my intellectual freedom. Were I there and surviving, I probably would be playing the game that everybody else plays, where Susie calls and says, hey, we're going to we're going to do a grant that's like a multi-institution grant, and you're going to be the person that's the cognitive scientist who's going to be saying what it feels like to be this kind of person in an fMRI machine for the medical school for this little part of this 20 professor institution. And you go, okay, and like they're just coming up with bullcrap to write a grant around, and it's going to be a 40-page massive complicated grant application, but it's at the end of the day, it's really bullcrap, and all these people that they put on it really don't care whether they get. But eventually someone hits gold and money gets spread around, and they go, okay, I got to do something that I was part of a grant. This is all a game. It's all just a stupid game. No one there, very few people there, are really focusing on the questions that they think are the best, and spending years focusing on answering those huge questions that need to be answered, because they're so distracted about being the guy or gal who brought in a big grant and then gets invited to the president's office or the president's parties because of it. And that's what buying my intellectual freedom. This last book, I was able to work from 2010 to 2020, almost 10 years. Tim Barber and myself, we worked on this idea. It came out in 2022, Express the Human, decoding the language of motion, answering Darwin's, from 200 years ago, his question, why do we have emotional expressions? Why don't we just keep it all buttoned up inside? What is the point of emotional expressions as a social animal? Answering this from first principles, and it's kind of a whole book. But of course, in this case, this is getting back to COVID. I was censored for 2 years by the federal government, amongst other hundreds of thousands of others. But as one of the bigger voices in the anti-lockdown community, I was censored. My YouTube channel was censored. My Twitter was censored for 2 years. I was suspended multiple times, permanently suspended once. And then for 2 years, they clicked my sensitive content button. Like if I was a porn star, I would say I'm sensitive content, so people suddenly don't see porn. That kind of. They purposely put that there and forced me to be sensitive content, which means that basically no one could see my tweets unless they allowed themselves to see porn. Because you're not really going to say I want to see sensitive content unless you're interested in porn. Anyway, it took 2 years for finally them to pull that sensitive content off. So my launch of my 6th book, when I've been covered in Scientific American dozens of times, and Discover and Wired and the New York Times, all these different places with all my other books. This time, because I was a COVID skeptic, all the science journalists that I had followed as of 2019 dropped me. They didn't follow anymore. They actually wrote on Twitter, joking, well, let's make an app so that if we ever see Mark's book come across our desks to cover it, the app tells us it's one of Mark Changizi's book, we won't cover it. They're black making jokes to blacklist me. And of course, they're not going to be covering my book. My book, because I was censored and couldn't promote it, I was not able to promote it. And because of the the general blacklisting of leftist science journalists, I was covered nowhere. So going from hundreds of stories about my other books to zero coverage of the 6th book. So effectively 10 years of work just went completely uncovered. Now, in the long run, it's the answer to why we evolved emotional expressions. It'll eventually bubble up to be correct. Someone else might discover and say, "Oh shit, Mark discovered this."
Yeah, but it's still frustrating.
It's frustrating, you say.
Now, I have similar experience. I don't have quite the profile you do, either physically or socially. But I came across the Zika phenomenon. 2019. I mean, I was alive in 2016. I was aware of it. I was skeptical at that point. I'm like, I never heard of Zika. I researched. It's like, this is a dengue. Dengue doesn't cause microcephaly. Why would Zika do it? Blah, blah, blah. And then, but 3 years later, just kind of popped up on my Facebook feed that I had said something about it. I'm like, I had 3 years under my belt just to kind of look at it. And I'm just a schlub. I'm just a regular primary care doctor. I'm not a researcher. I'm not part of an institution, blah, blah, blah. And so similar to the HRT thing, I just kind of took my own look at it. I'm like, well, there's no there. There's nothing. It's all clouds built on fairy dust, built on top of, sand castles. And anyway, I had the book out. I get I get bupkis. I get nothing from the infectious disease community, such as it is. All the influence. Everyone's all lockstep. I saw a recent meme. It's like about politicians. If you think politicians, are corruptible, why do you think scientists are not?
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's not just that they're, this is true for all of, I've got a lot of discoveries that I'm proud of. Most of my discoveries, and some of them have been recognized as seminal while I'm alive. And this is a seminal discovery. But often the folks that are older than me, they don't believe it. they're never going to believe it. These are just entrenched. Really what it takes is that the next generation that comes out, they've seen the paper and they start to say, I believe it, and they cite it and so forth. No one is corrupted that, the folks that a lot of my discoveries, they're just never going to believe it, especially if they're older than me or the same generation as me. They just never are going to believe it, and no one is paying them or corrupting them to do it. And of course, there's implicit ones. If they're actual competitors on that same theory, they want to you're always internally motivated, and it's going to affect their judgment that they're going to sort of argue against mine so they can keep on getting grants for theirs. But it's usually not conscious corruption. It's more like they're in their own camp, and they're kind of see me as the enemy, and they've kind of talked themselves out of the fact that I could be right, and they talk themselves into the fact that they are right. So these things usually take a generation. I'm more frustrated with this expressive human because it's not even to the place where it's being ignored. It's so ignored that ignored doesn't even apply.
Well, how do we change that? I mean, whom are the people that you follow, and is there kind of this shadow university that is startable? I've interviewed Paul Freiters, who's an economist, and he wants to start the different university of people who have genuine inquiry. I think you'd fall into that category. I don't know if you know him.
I don't know him. No.
Well, happy to make the intro. But how does alternate universe start? The Daily Wire, I give subscription money to, and they've got my favorite Andrew Klavan, and Michael Knowles is kind of a close second. And now they're doing movies and they're doing podcasts and doing this and that. But it's still hard to disseminate when you're up against a kind of a monolithic force and power. I've read your work, and it's really insightful. I find some of your stuff jaw-droppingly great, and I'm a big fan. But you're not going to rely on me, and nobody should. But where does this go? So that the ideas, you mentioned kind of the strong horse theory, that's what people follow. They follow the victories. And even as hollow and shallow as they might be emotionally and morally, people will just go with that because it's the winning team. Now, how do we get to be the winning team? How do you get to be the winning player? How do you get expressly to humans?
Well, I purposely don't think about that kind of thing. This is a way of not answering your question, but it is a strategy that I've always had. A lot of folks, when they make a discovery, if you're lucky to get a discovery, then they think about, how do I make sure my discovery gets to as many heads as possible, and make sure that it's really part of the literature and just wins, so that by the time I'm dead, everybody recognizes it as the discovery. And that's always been I've always avoided doing that, because if you do that, you're going to be the kind of person that just keeps on working on that idea and adding a little, and then a lot of these people will have 50 publications, 40 of them are edited chapters in books about that general topic, and they're just republishing variants of the same thing with slight additions. You're going to spend the rest of your life trying to bang away to make sure just forget about it. In the long run, very long run, just think about just let it go. I just let the idea go. The communities, in a free expression sort of science community, will figure out what to do with it eventually in the right way in a very long run. But my job is to not think about that, so I can hopefully find new ideas in new areas where I can actually make substantive discoveries again. And maybe one of those will explode while I'm alive, to sort of appreciate that they actually like it. But again, I want to move to the next one. So I'm willing to, realize that expressly we just didn't do that well. But in the long run, the truth will be out there. The publication is there. I'm someone that people know as someone who has other discoveries. Eventually, it should just, some young person will say, holy crap, Changizi did this like in the 2020s, and Barbara did this 2020s, and we've just sort of started thinking those similar lines in 2060. Maybe it takes till 2060 or till 2120. I don't know.
Yeah. Have you been Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan or Tim Pool or anything like that? I mean, have you had a leg up on any of the kind of major open-minded videos or podcasts?
You mean like been on their show?
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson follows me. I've had some interactions with them. You know, the Weinsteins both know me. I've met one in person. We talk, and then but I haven't been on their show either. Joe Rogan, I have no interaction with him at all. So I've been on lots of podcasts and shows and things like this and TED Talks prior to COVID. I was in hundreds and hundreds of these sorts of things. Post COVID, though, it's mostly podcasts and shows that are political, COVID related, and now 10/7 related things. There's been very few things where I'm invited as a scientist who discovered this, like it used to be the case. I'm brought in a very different kind of capacity now. All
right, so I'm kind of rounding out the hour here.
Yeah.
I'm going to, again, put up your book for people to look at, and they can purchase it here. This is Amazon, and you also have a really fascinating page. Whenever I see it, I think of Gary Johnson being asked about Aleppo. Do you remember that at all? So he was running for president as a libertarian, and he was asked about getting back to Syria, and he was like, "What about Aleppo?" And so he said, "What is a Aleppo?" And that's true. And that, I mean, he was totally flummoxed. He had never heard of Aleppo and the city. And so this was kind of ruination moment. It was kind of like, what Lepos? I mean, Lepos, I've heard of hippos, that kind of thing. But he didn't say it. But clearly from his face, he's like, what is Aleppo?
Well, it'd been much better if he didn't know what Damascus or some other thing that's equally unheard of as Aleppo, but it sounded like Damascus. What is Damascus? It would be bad enough, but because of it's starting with a Damascus,
right.
It just made it funny and something you can make fun of.
So I only think of that because you have a loof wired, and right. I think what's aloof,
Well, right. That's the joke there. So it's aloof. Always aim to be aloof. Loofs of America unite.
Yeah, right. So that's what I think of the Aleppo one whenever I see your loof wired. So I recommend people go to your website as well. Do you have any final crowning words for us?
I did. There's something I was going to mention earlier that you had mentioned. You noticed the changes of HRT because in your lifetime you watched the transition occur, right? And so you could see, like, hey, this isn't right. I'm seeing mass hysteria in real time, like a minor mass hysteria within the medical community. But for the next generation that grows up, once a mass hysteria has occurred and the next generation grows up post hysteria, it's so hard for them to see, right? They're just growing up with this new consensus. It's very hard for us to go back in time and say, holy crap, like in 1972, between March and April, suddenly all the public, you're not going to see any fine resolution in that. It's just because the way the publication gets, you're not going to notice that. So this is one of the things that's difficult as a scientist to look at existing theories in the consensus in the field. Very often, all the stuff that I ever threw was complete garbage. Like, it wasn't because I was smart. The actual ideas that existed in the literature were so stupid. And I'm sure they probably were brought in for some sudden transformation that I never figured out when it occurred, per se, because they were so dumb, like COVID level dumb, right? But they've just been sitting as consensus for decades, sometimes 100 years. And it's suddenly, but if I had been old enough to watch the transition occur, it's so much easier to see. But man, if you don't watch a transition occur and it's presented as consensus, really hard to see it as something that should be overthrown because it just looks like vanilla. It's just baseline. It just seems right because it's what you've always heard.
Yeah, no,
that's not really. Anyway, it occurred to me as we talked about earlier. As a final, thanks for having me here. Again, if you're interested in follow me at Twitter. I've got YouTube series at Science Moment series at YouTube and at Rumble. And there's Loofwired magazine that you can find at loofwired.com.
Fair enough. So here's your Twitter page. And just my final last words. People should help support my podcast if they choose to by going out and buying my book. It's on Amazon. This is a Kirkus review, which is independent, and you can read it right here. It's a provocative peek into the real life mechanics of the scientific process. It is inexplicably Zika simply vanished from the globe despite any absence of vaccine to counter it. Bach goes basically scrupulous process of rigorous research Well, I astutely dissect the way in which a scrupulous process of scientific research was bypassed in favor of manufactured drama, one to this day that has never been adequately corrected. So, nonetheless, what I was hugely excited when I wrote this book. I had the kind of the electricity of discovery. It's like, I can't believe how deep this thing goes, that there are thousands of researchers writing, I don't know, thousands of papers. There had been like literally zero, well, like 8 papers ever written on Zika before like 2007. Yeah. So completely non-human problem, not a human illness and so forth. And then it shows up and everyone's like, oh my God, this is what, they're all doing this. And there had been no sign. There was no Zika tests. There was no microcephaly registry. There's no data comparison. There was no data really done in real time, blah, blah, blah. They changed the standards for what microcephaly was and wasn't. Then it completely disappeared. The very first year they started to monitor it, 2016, it disappeared as a phenomenon. It's never come back. And nobody has an explanation. The explanations they have are so like, dog ate my homework. My little baby brother puked on my whatever. It's just like incredible stuff. They say, oh, it must have been variant strain, or they got sudden immunity, or whatever. And the fact that it showed up in Brazil but didn't show up in Colombia, like as if somehow the mosquito only speaks Portuguese and not Spanish. I mean, it just whack stuff. And I can't get for me to get any coverage is like pulling teeth. And I've been on, a few of the minor podcasts on, our side, as it were. But, the monolithic aspect of the, research establishment is just kind of a weird thing. They're I think they must have a sense of vulnerability that let anything in. If they don't let any light in, that they're all going to, wither away like the, pouring water on the Witch and Wizard of Oz. I mean, just kind of a funny phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that the way that science works is ultimately a bunch of super bright individuals, and then you throw them in a pond and they're just a bunch of schooling fish that just all school. Like, it doesn't matter that they're just smart. At the end of the day, what's explaining their behavior is just starlings swarming all together and doing their stuff. And the fact that they're smart is part of it, but that's not what drives almost any of the behavior at the large scale in science or in free expression, in terms of the social networks more generally.
Yeah, there's a quote. I don't know if I can get it right, and I haven't sourced it, but supposedly H.L. Mencken said, he's got a bunch of great quotes, but apparently one is, if we take a moron and put a PhD after, we school him and work him up to a PhD, does not necessarily mean he's lost all aspects of the, prior traits. So it hasn't stopped necessarily being a moron. He's, albeit credentialed. I'm not calling people with PhDs morons, but there are some people who, have their own issues, and they didn't solve all of them by getting a degree. And conversely,
and a lot of the folks that were, that found themselves on the zero COVID cult, these are super bright people. They are much smarter than me on individual exams. They're very bright people. Some of the brightest folks are out there became zero COVID. The problem is not that they were never morons. They were super bright. What makes them dumb is their susceptibility to these kinds of social contagions. And so all of their smarts then are being employed to create and post hoc justify the kinds of narratives that are evolving within these new communities. And that's what makes these narratives so dangerous, is because you've got really smart people. It's not just individuals, a whole communities where it's selecting for among smart individuals, it's selecting for the best justifications for the post hoc, for the behaviors that they've already been engaging in. Like, we shouldn't wear masks. And then people who typically wore masks were wearing them as membership signals. And pretty soon, more and more justifications from really smart people start bubbling up about why masks aren't just membership signals. They actually work and they're virtuous, right? That's the standard pattern, and all from membership signal to virtue signal happens in the same way. But Israel is doing genocide. That was a membership signal. Anyone saying Israel is doing genocide in the weeks after 10/7 was saying, I'm a member of the community where Israel sucks and Hamas is great, whatever, that kind of thing. But keep your eyes open. Over time, that membership signal turns into a virtue signal. That is, it is virtuous and true and right. And there's these publications that are coming out arguing why what they're actually doing really does, despite it being completely crazy, is genocide. more and more sophisticated, not dumb. They're going to be sophisticated. They're smart, right? They come up with sophisticated justifications that they're smart in the sense that they spread. They're designed to spread to the next brain and spread across brains. That's why. So that's what we always see. So these people are smart, and that's what makes them dumb is their susceptibility to social contagion. And what makes these communities smart in terms of dangerous is that you've got lots of smart people who are swayable, and they use all their smarts to post hoc justify the bullshit that their community has decided.
I think at some point we have to take away the adjective smart.
Well, yeah, they're smart.
They're book smart.
SAT, they know a lot of shit, and they have high SAT scores or whatever, right? In that kind of typical sense, they're smart in the way that we typically call people smart in that sense, right?
Yes. But it's what Ronald Reagan said about the left. He said it's not that they're ignorant. It's just that so much of what they know is wrong.
Yeah.
Anyway, but since you and I are correct, we're going to leave it there. Call it a day. I'm going to thank you for being on. I'm in your debt, and you get a free dinner whenever you show up in Boston. All right.
All right, will do.